folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and gentle musical meanderings. Finally, at long last, after what feels like a forever, I'm finally getting back to my deep dive reviews. It's always meant for these to be the meat and potatoes of the channel, really. But whenever you get to the end of the year, you've got the top 20. And then the beginning of this year, you have all this new music. So I kind of get distracted from these things during the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And it's too bad because in this particular case, sometimes things come up that I really would like to address, like the unfortunate passing of Emmett Chapman in November of last year. Emmett Chapman, although not a huge name outside of certain circles, is actually an extremely influential person and musician and inventor and kind of all-around polymath genius type of guy. Emmett Chapman is best known, of course, for being the inventor of the Chapman stick. And despite having quite a bit of musical reach because of this instrument, he only ever recorded one album, and that album was Parallel Galaxy. Parallel Galaxy was recorded in the mid-80s, 1985. And just listening to it, it's hard to kind of get an idea about what's gone into the creation of that album and the actual genius that's contained within its runtime. Parallel Galaxy is a really important stick recording, but to really get an understanding of this album and what makes it so completely amazing, I think it's important to take a look at Emmett Chapman and the stick that he created, because this album is a great example of stick music. And to understand stick music, I think it's helpful to understand the stick and, of course, the guy that created it, Emmett Chapman. Emmett Chapman was born in 1936 and had his first instrument was the accordion. Got that when he was 13. And then throughout his teens, he played some different instruments. And finally, later on in his teens, kind of got into playing guitar, electric guitar, strumming along with Johnny Mathis tunes and that sort of thing. But he was always kind of influenced very strongly by the polyphonic nature of keyboard instruments, and felt like the guitar had this capacity for expression, conversely, that those instruments didn't have. I mean, when you have a piano, you got a hammer that's thrown against a string. You have no chance for vibrato or pitch bending. It has its own modes of expressiveness, but you don't have that same kind of fingers on string feeling like bending a string on a guitar. That's just not available. So Emmett, being the kind of person that he was, a very eclectic, open-minded genius, set about experimenting on the guitar and its design. And over the course of a good 10 or 15 years, he tried all these different permutations of guitar, different tunings, different string combinations, and finally came up with what ended up being the Chapman stick. But it was really the kind of almost Satori moment that he had in 1969 when he realized that he could take strings and tap them with his fingers. Now, he was not the first person to do this. String tapping had been happening for a very, very long time before that, as long as strings and frets had been around, really. There's even some record of a guitar player a country guitar player who used to play guitar like tap style. But the unique thing about the Chapman stick is that it's an instrument that's specifically designed to maximize that style of playing, that way of interacting with the instrument. So Emmett's starting point was the guitar. Probably one of the most influential instruments that the West ever produced. Ended up being influential worldwide. Great instrument, compact, but it does have its limitations. And one of the limitations that Emmett Chapman saw with it was its range. So even before anything else happened with the design of the stick, his early versions of the experimentation was about expanding the range of the guitar. Okay. Now he found out early on that the top string of the guitar can only get so tight before it breaks. So there's a limit on how high on a standard size guitar you can get a guitar note. Okay, the open string on a standard guitar is E. Okay, so he found that, after messing around with it, there was a certain standard he couldn't get past as far as the tension goes on the top string. So rather than add range on top, he began exploring adding range on bottom. And what Emmett really liked was the sound of fourths, okay, which is fine because the guitar is generally tuned in fourths. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, a fourth is an interval between two different notes, okay? So, and it usually has to do with like the scale. So, for example, if you go up 4 degrees in the scale, that's a fourth, okay? So the distance between these first two strings, that's a fourth. So here, also here. Okay, now, that's true for the guitar up to a point. Because when you get between the next two strings, it's actually a major third. Okay, and the top two strings are another fourth. Okay, so what Emmett started doing was he started adding force below the top two strings. And as he did that, that changed the spot where that major third happened on the guitar. And as he did that, he started adding strings below and started pushing that major second further and further down until he finally ended up with this 9-string model of the guitar. Now, the problem with the 9-string model of the guitar was the neck was prohibitively big. He couldn't reach the lowest bass notes, which are as far down as a bass guitar is now. That lowest standard, like low C, low B, that's the lowest limit that an electric string could resonate and still get a good sound out of it. So what he did was he inverted those strings and made the bottom 3 strings in inverted fifths. Now, inversions work so that a fourth and a fifth are the same note, they're just octave displaced. So when Emmett inverted those last 3 strings in that 9-string guitar, it gave rise to what would end up becoming the separated fourths, fifths tuning that seems so curious on the stick. But to be honest, at this point, he still wasn't even thinking about tapping or anything else. For him, he was still strumming it like it was one big thing, you know. Eventually, this Sartori moment came to him in 1969, quite famously. Legend has it from watching Jimi Hendrix play the Star Spangled Banner. He had this part where he had his one hand in the air, he was doing hammer-ons with his hand. Don't know, never actually got that confirmed from Emmett, but that's the legend, right? He literally went to a mirror and looked at himself in the mirror and says, I want to be able to play an instrument that looks like this, and created an instrument that fit that shape. So then he started tapping, and he realized that his fingers now had a perpendicular relationship to the strings. With that in place, and the unique tuning in place, we start to see kind of what the actual stick starts to look like. But even now, when you look at the stick, it's a 2-sided instrument. Now we call this the bass side, we call this the melody side. And the bass side can go to one amp, and the melody side can go to another amp. So you can process the 2 sides totally differently. But still, if you approach the instrument like, I'm going to play a bass and a guitar at the same time, you're going to run into trouble. This was my problem. I had this thought in my mind that, well, I'm just going to take over both roles. But the problem is because of the way the tuning is set up in the stick, it doesn't really allow itself to be played like a normal bass. For example, if you try to walk a bass line with fifth tuning, every time you run into like a second, sooner or later you're going to have to make a big skip, right? Right, so those big movements are not impossible, and people do them. There's people who walk bass lines on stick all the time, great, but it just is difficult. It's not a natural way the instrument doesn't lend itself to that sort of playing very, very easily. On a fourth string bass is right there, and that sort of melody playing is available on the right hand side. So, and you don't have those big jumps. But what the fifths does on the bass side of the instrument is it allows the bass notes to get far enough away from these upper strings that these can be used as harmony notes. Here, notes that are very far apart are very close to one another, right? And if you have to make bass chords with your left hand in normal, they get too close, they get too muddy. But now those notes are far enough away that they sound nice and clear, and especially with that open fifths tuning, it gives a little bit of extra resonance. Plus, there's crossover now with notes on this side. So you have this kind of shimmering effect that can happen. It's almost like a 12-string guitar where you have control over both strings. So if you accept that the instrument is not 2 separate things, but the stick is an instrument that's supposed to be played as a whole thing, it's a holistic instrument. When I made that paradigm shift on the instrument, I started having a lot more success with understanding how to play it, right? So letting go of thinking about being able to play a walking bass line and solo with the same hand was an important step for me. Then I started thinking about my left hand more as a chordal thing. And that allowed my hand to be more free to play melody. Was designed specifically to give Emmett a certain degree of harmonic and stylistic freedom, to where, like a piano player, very often you don't really need anybody else in a band. A person can play solo piano and be the whole thing, and that was his goal with the Chapman stick. And that's what's realized on Parallel Galaxies so well. If you know that about what Emmett was about. Parallel Galaxies was recorded with just 4 people. Emmett on stick, a drummer, a harmonica player, his brother Dan Chapman on playing harmonica, a vocalist doing a few tracks with some vocals on them. And the vocals are kind of funny in this album. I often call them the chicken trombone vocals because he kind of does this quirky thing with his voice, and it's kind of a funny thing. Not normal, not a mainstream style of expression for sure. But that's part of Emmett. That's part of what he was about. He was not about trying to fit into any one thing. He wanted musical freedom. And whenever you listen to Parallel Galaxies, there are things about this that can kind of be weird to listen to because as an album with no overdubs, there's some grit in there. You know, whenever you're playing the stick as a whole instrument, the right hand and the left hand are interdependent but not independent. Things that the right hand does affects the left hand. It's very difficult to play them completely separate from one another. So you'll hear parts on Parallel Galaxies where you'll hear maybe little things where things speed up in the left hand or slow down or things don't quite, they affect each other. And as a person who doesn't know that about the Chapman stick, about the fact that you have to play it like a whole instrument, that can feel kind of like odd or offsetting. But understanding that his right hand and his left hand are interdependent with one another, they're playing with and against each other. Those kinds of abnormalities and irregularities really give this album a spectacularly human feel. And conversely, you'll have these moments on Parallel Galaxies where you'll hear Emmett's ability to actually have his hands do separate things. So he has sections in here where his ability to play with 2 different dynamic levels. The left hand plays very quietly, and the right hand plays with a lot stronger and more expressively. These types of things happen on the album too. So it's sort of this dichotomy of how you hear the hands affect each other, but also how they have their own roles to play throughout the course of the album. Another really important expressive mode that you're going to hear on Parallel Galaxies as well is another one of Emmett Chapman's inventions, his effects setup, which he called the Patch of Shades. And I don't know a whole lot about Patch of Shades, but what I do know about it is that the Patch of Shades was a sort of a thing that you could rock your feet back and forth on while you play, and it would change the timbre and the sound of the instrument, kind of like a wah pedal, but in more than 2 dimensions. He uses this a lot on this album, and it's a very subtle. It provides this kind of subtle flange very often to the things, or whenever he wants to kind of open up and make things sound a little more gritty, he'll open up that side of the envelope and give it a little bit of edge. So that's another really important component of Emmett's creativity that goes into Parallel Galaxies as well, beyond just the amazing things he's doing as a technician on the stick. But the thing that really makes Parallel Galaxies kind of hard to grab onto so often, I think, is Emmett's desire to play with some freedom. You know, whenever you play a melody and you're playing jazz, very often you'll reinvent the melody for the solo. What Emmett does instead is he not only reinvents the melody, he reinvents the harmony, he reinvents the style as he goes. So his soloing is not just him playing chord change and reinventing the melody. He uses songs as a starting point for amazing excursions into style and harmony. And the harmony is even more complicated because, again, Emmett had this theoretical system called the modal offset system. And he would have some diagrams of this. And the modal offset system is loosely based on astrology, of all things. And this is a particular kind of theoretical approach that Emmett used to reinvent the harmonies of songs that he played. Particularly on here, there's a version of Eleanor Rigby that starts off in one way, and as you go through the tune, it almost gets to the point where Eleanor Rigby's been completely deconstructed. It feels like he's doing something totally different in the middle of the song. But I will argue that these sections actually are him not only reinventing melody, but reinventing the harmony through his offset modal theories paradigm. So this is one of the things that actually in some ways I think makes the album a little bit harder to listen to if you're not familiar with Emmett's technique, if you're not familiar with how the stick is set up, and also Emmett's philosophy on continually trying to break free of the constraints of the norm. I've always been under the impression that Emmett Chapman wanted to play exactly what he wanted to play, whenever he wanted to play it. He wanted the freedom to play whatever he wanted, whatever came to him. Not unlike Keith Jarrett would do, like on the Cone concert, these types of free improvisations. But the difference is that Emmett also didn't want to sound like anybody else. He had some influence from guitar and John McLaughlin, that sort of thing. But ultimately, he wanted the freedom to play music on his own terms. And considering how much energy and investment he put into the instrument, it's always kind of been astounding to me that he only ever released this one recording. He was actually a very prolific performer, but not a prolific recorder. Didn't record very many things, which is what makes this album such a gem and such a classic and so important to the stick repertoire, because it is an album made by the master, the guy that created the instrument, playing the instrument in the style that he envisioned it playing in. And he always insisted he didn't really want people to play like him. But still, we look to this album as inspiration as stick players, as what's possible on the instrument with the kind of investment and the kind of vision that Emmett had on it. So it's an important recording, even if you're not a stick player. But I think that having some idea about how the stick works is helpful. So I hope you got something out of the demonstration that happened earlier with this. And I also hope you liked this video. And if you did, please like and subscribe and share the video out with your friends. Follow me over on Spotify. I'll be putting up some Parallel Galaxy tunes up there on my Best of 2022 playlist. Keep an eye over my blog too. I'll be doing early eliminations, tier 1 eliminations for the Best of 2022, all in text over on the blog. And there's going to be a link down below for that in the description. So until I see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.